to. Yeah, so my background, early professional career was actually in the Navy. I spent my time in the nuclear power, nuclear engineering side of the Navy. Started in aircraft carriers, taught at Naval Nuclear Power School for a time, and then went into the submarine community. And I did all of that for about 14 years. Had a family event that came up unexpectedly, so I resigned my active duty commission, came back to Cincinnati, which is where I was born and raised and where I am today. I swore when I left that I was never coming back, but everybody in Cincinnati, I think, says they're never coming back, and they all do. And so I came back in 2009, and worked for a defense contractor for a number of years, was their chief financial officer, chief strategy officer. Had an opportunity to take a doctoral fellowship up at Case Western. And my primary area of interest, the thing that had really piqued my curiosity, was the strength of informal networks in civilian organizations. Obviously, in a military setting or context, it's very command and control driven, very hierarchical. The formal network is very strong there. And then I transitioned into the civilian world, and I found that there was this incredibly influential network, shadow network of communication and collaboration that seemed to have a tremendous impact on how strategy activated, what happens in organizations, what doesn't happen. And so that was really my area of interest. So went up to Case, and really my focus was on the role of informal networks in activating strategy. And then out of that was born S2A, which is my company, which stands for Strategy to Action. I'll talk a little bit more about it when we get into the presentation. Have been doing that for 10 years. This will be our 10th year today, actually. And we have folks setting up just outside my office for our shindig this evening to celebrate. And we're about 24 strong, and we're all over the US. So although I'm in Cincinnati and our core team is in Cincinnati, we have folks in Washington, D.C., and we have folks out in New Mexico and in San Diego, where our learning development team is. So super excited to be with you. It'll be an interesting use case that I'll be talking about today on how we used ONA also in a military context to address issues of suicidal ideation and behavior, which is a pretty extreme use case for ONA compared to maybe what you're used to hearing. So excited to share that with you.
Thanks, Brad. And that's what you had shared with our NYU class, and you've got a few other NYU alums here as well, who are I think excited to hear about that because it is such a unique situation. So those of you who have joined, feel free to use the chat to share who are you, where are you located, what are you up to, and any kind of curiosities about ONA and things like that. I think in maybe just the interest of time, Brad, we'll kind of just let you present for a bit, and then we'll save a good amount of time for Q&A and anything else along the way.
Yeah, that'd be great. All right, let me take over the screen. Okay, are you seeing that all right?
Yep, that's great.
Excellent. Okay, yeah, so my plan, I want to give you a little context by talking a little bit about what we do at S2A. That'll provide a little bit of background, important framework for how we got into this particular scope of work. I'll talk about NILE, which is the use case. NILE stands for NCO, Inclusive Leadership Excellence. In the military, you're rewarded for acronyms. And in this case, it was an acronym inside of an acronym, so we got bonus points for that. But I'll talk about where NILE came from, why it was of particular importance to our organization, and a little bit about its status today. And then into Constellation, which is our ONA platform. The actual engine itself is from a company called Polynode, which is based out of Sydney. But we run that on our own platform, which generates all the necessary reports, both individually and organizationally. And then, yeah, as discussed, leave as much time for Q&A at the end. But it is a small group, so it would be great if this were conversational. So if you have any questions along the way, don't feel like you have to hold them to the end. Feel free to just pop off of mute and ask any questions that you have if you have them, or if something isn't making sense. Yeah, so I already said a little bit of this in my intro, but S2A was founded on April 5th of 2014, so 10 years ago today. And we're positioned as a culture and strategy design firm, really working at the intersection of culture, strategy, and innovation from the sense of, how do we bring the appropriate technology solution to the table to help facilitate this kind of merging of two worlds as related to culture and strategy design. When I say strategy, we do some advising work that is about the external world. How do organizations position themselves to be able to take advantage of strategic conditions or environmental conditions? But for the most part, when we say strategy, we're talking inside strategy or workforce development or people related strategy. So those 9 boxes you see on the right are the sandboxes that we typically tend to play in. So engagement, inclusion, belonging, retention. Knowledge transfer is a big one right now in organizations that have an aging workforce and then a younger one coming in and kind of a gap between the two. So how do we get information to the people who need it most? And then lots in technology adoption. So whether that's new ERP systems or we're doing a lot in the healthcare space right now with new healthcare systems. How do we get populations to adopt that technology as quickly as possible? And then in the bottom right, a lot still in the M&A space or in the restructuring space, there does still seem to be a lot of activity in the PE space, although it is cooling off a little bit. So a good deal of our work is in post-close integration when you're bringing these two organizations together. I mentioned Constellation, so that's our ONA platform. The ONA engine itself, as I said, is with Polynode. Would be happy to connect any of you to anyone at Polynode. They're absolutely fantastic to work with. And for those of you who are NYU alum or who were maybe on that call a couple months ago, it was actually Chad Tabarner from Polynode who put that together. And then our why, we're really passionate about this idea that work shouldn't suck. People should be able to come in and do their best possible work, and the conditions should exist for that to happen. And it's primarily management's responsibility and leadership's responsibility to create those conditions. So how do we go? And you'll see in the NILE program, our focus in that particular use case is on the mid-level manager. How do we give them agency over the culture so that they can create conditions for the people below them? And we know, there's plenty of data out there to suggest that most strategies succeed or fail in the middle management level of an organization. Top level executives will decide what organizations start to do, but mid-level leaders will decide whether that thing is successful or not. And so we put a lot of our time in kind of bridging the gap between those two worlds. And as you can see, we're pretty industry agnostic. So these are just different organizations that we've worked with, which kind of runs the range, the NCAA up in the upper right, and then nonprofits like the Cincinnati Zoo down there in the bottom. And you can see the various DoD entities. And I was sharing, Melissa, so the company I'll be out there for in Denver is actually Populous. They're up in the upper left, sports architecture design. But today's is going to be focused primarily on the Air Force and the scope of work we're doing for the Air Force Special Operations Command. So let me start with just giving you a little bit of background about this particular project, and then we can kind of move our way into how we use organizational network analysis to facilitate that work. So NILE, NCO Inclusive Leadership Excellence, didn't have a title. In June of 2020. It was an open solicitation that came from Air Force Special Operations Command to the contracting world. And they were looking for solutions to challenges of suicidal ideation and behavior, primarily in what they referred to as their junior airman level or rank. So this would be like the 18 to 25-year-old population, enlisted, fairly new. This is probably the first thing that they've done after high school. They're away from home. It's a very different, as all of you I'm sure know, this new kind of emerging adults coming into the workforce are fundamentally different. I know every generation says the next generation is but this generation is fundamentally different in the way they process information and the way they think about knowledge and wisdom and in their ability to critically solve problems that maybe don't have a ready answer. And so that population has struggled historically within the Air Force to integrate or to build strong interpersonal skills. So the original solicitation asked for an interpersonal skill building program for junior airmen to help combat issues of suicidal ideation and behavior. Uh, we bid that solicitation in August of 2020. And something I didn't mention in the intro, although I did say that I was in the Navy, we are a 100% veteran owned organization, and about 70% of our senior leaders are from military backgrounds. So our learning design team, which is out in San Diego, is headed up by Kristen Carter, who's a former Naval Academy professor and curriculum designer. And then we have folks, as I said, in DC with Navy backgrounds, Air Force backgrounds. So we know that context really well. And and unfortunately and sadly, anyone who has spent a significant amount of time in the military has encountered issues of suicide or suicidal ideation and behavior. So when we saw the solicitation come out, it became a bit of a passion project for our team. And so we were really keen to want to bid it, but we were also keen to approach the Air Force ahead of time and say, we would like to bid this, but we want to know that we can approach this differently than the way this challenge, this insidious challenge, has been addressed in the past. And of course, contracting officers can't tell you anything. So they said, well, you submit whatever you want to submit, and the command will decide who wins this particular contract. And so we did, we bid it, and we won it at the end of August 2020. And again, remember what's happening in the world in August of 2020. So it was a very unusual time, and mental health crises were on the rise. They were working extremely chaotic hours and weird shifts to try to accommodate social distancing. But when you're in the military, you also have a mission that has to be accomplished. So some of those provisions or precautions um, couldn't really be tackled. And so it was quite a time to be taken on a project of this scope. And so the first thing we did was we went out, and as you saw in our model, we conducted what's called cultural discovery. So we spent about 2 months with the command, really trying to understand. And it was in this particular command is in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So we were trying to really understand, what it's like to be a junior airman embedded in this particular culture. What does the world look like from their perspective? And then how do the NCOs, which are like the mid-level managers, also enlisted, so NCO stands for non-commissioned officer, what does the world look like from their position? And then finally, what does it look like from the position of senior leadership? And where are the gaps, the perception gaps or perspective taking gaps that might exist? And what could we do? What might we be able to design that could help address those issues? And so we discovered right away, I mean, we hadn't even been there a week, and we realized that the real challenge as it relates to the issue that was put out for solicitation is in the NCO ranks. It's in that level. It's in that mid-level of the organization. And the NCOs are the ones who are creating the culture or the context for the very junior airmen who are of concern. So if I'm an 18, 19, 20-year-old and I'm new to this command structure, my first boss is going to be an NCO. That's typically the way that works. But what we also discovered, which was quite interesting, was when we talked to the NCOs about the culture of the organization, of the culture of the command, they tended to describe it as this thing that was just happening to them. Like they were just like victims of this culture, and it rains down on them, and they have absolutely no responsibility for any of it. So we do this really interesting activity in the workshop today. If I don't know if you're familiar with a tool called Mentimeter, which is it's like an audience polling tool. So you get on your phone, questions pop up. There's a couple of those different types of apps, but you can answer, and in real time, the answers will pop up on the screen, but they're anonymized. So you don't necessarily see who said what. And we use that in a lot of our sessions, but we use it in this one. And the question is, describe the Air Force Special Operations Command culture. And in one or two words, and they'll start typing things, and the words that pop up are not great. They create a picture for you of what it must be like to work in this kind of environment. And when we get to the end of that activity, I'll always say, okay, so if you didn't know anything about this organization and I said to you, I have a great opportunity for you, it would be working at a place, and here's how the people who work in it describe it, how many of you would raise your hand and want to go be a part of that? And they get a good laugh from that. But then I ask them, so who's responsible for those conditions? Who's actually creating those conditions? And there's not as much talking at that point. People get kind of quiet because that's when we begin to make the point that you are all co-creating the culture every single day. You are responsible for the culture within your part of the organization, and each of you co-sign on these conditions every day when you allow them to happen or when you don't take steps to improve that. We use that to then transition into this discussion about the conditions, the cultural conditions that could contribute to issues like suicidal ideation and behavior. And these are pretty well documented. And we're only looking at the conditions that a leader might have some control over. So we're not looking necessarily at family related mental health issues or substance abuse issues or other things that could be contributing to that that would be outside of the control of a leader. So when we look at those conditions, there are three that tend to stand out. One is isolation. So allowing these young people to basically hole up in their dorm rooms and not interact or not engage with anybody outside of their work hours. The second is loneliness, which is more connected to the fact, I could be surrounded by 20 or 30 or 40 people and still feel very lonely, very disconnected from that population. And then the last one is a lack of sense of purpose or connection to the mission of the organization. And in this way, we're really talking about how do you identify your personal mission and then find a way to connect that in some way to what the organization is doing. And we know that that's very important as it relates to issues of resiliency, for example, because if I wake up in the morning and I'm having a really tough time, I need some kind of goal or North Star that can give me a reason to want to keep going and moving through. So we begin to talk about, well, what are the cultural conditions that could be fighting that? And so what are the things that are happening right now that could be eroding or exacerbating issues of isolation, loneliness, and a lack of connection to mission and purpose? And that's really when we begin to start to see the shift. And the whole purpose of that, the objective of that, is to give these NCOs a sense of agency over the culture and to really think about the conditions that they're creating for the people under their charge. So everything I've just said is in the next couple slides, so I'm going to move through these really quickly. But again, the basic human-centered design challenge that was presented to us was connected to these rising suicide rates across the DoD over the past decade. Unfortunately, those numbers are still not improving as dramatically as we would like. And the primary population, although it is pervasive, and it's non-discriminatory, we do know that the junior enlisted service members tend to be the most impacted demographic. We also know that there are some conditions that you really can't do a whole lot about. So it's a 24/7 mission driven, high tempo organization. And, unlike, if you're working at your local Home Depot, you don't close up shop at 8 o'clock and go home. This is a 24/7 mission and world that they're living in. It's very high, particularly in special operations. It's a very high performing, high stress environment. And there's often not a clear endpoint. And again, if you think about where we were in October of 2020, I mean, nobody knew when the pandemic was going to end or let up or when we might return to some level of normalcy. And that creates some really difficult challenges as it relates to mental health and well-being, because I don't have an endpoint in sight. So I don't know how long I'm going to have to live in this environment. And then you're combining that with this uncertainty about the future, right? So we have that uncertainty, but then, as I said earlier, there's also this sort of lack of interpersonal skills, or as a young person, 18 or 19 years old, just a lack of experience navigating those conditions. I mean, they've never had to do that on their own. They've historically been in a household surrounded by people who were helping to guide those decisions in that pathway. But now I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm 19 years old. I just got a 35% interest car loan. I've got all kinds of these issues going on, and I don't know how to navigate these challenging conditions. So as I said, when we went in, our real focus was on this idea of prevention through virtue building, primarily within the NCO ranks. We use this diagram as a sort of analogy, a switch theory analogy for what's happening with suicidal ideation and behavior. And we use this diagram to point out that the majority of time and energy and effort within the DoD has been primarily in switches 7, 8, and 9. Which is really in this like kind of danger zone where the only real help that is appropriate at that point is professional help, professional medical help. And what we really wanted to focus on in the program were those switches 4, 5, and 6. So yes, I'm living in a higher stress than I would like environment. I can't persist in those levels for very long. So how do we begin to give people the skills necessary to back that off and move to a safer level of stress and related conditions? And then we always say when we're presenting this that switches 1, 2, and 3, this is, you're alive in the world, and so you're going to have stress. So this is a healthy place to be. 1, 2, and 3 is fine. You have classes that you have to complete for school. You have a mortgage that has to get paid. You have whatever it is. These are normal stressors that kind of keep us going and keep us motivated. And then, as I said, again, why focus on the NCOs? Well, because they're the most significant influence to the junior airmen. We need to empower them to take agency over the culture and proactively adopt these inclusive leadership behaviors. And then we want to nurture amongst them a sense of kind of personal mission and identity. So help them with that self-awareness and leadership awareness, so that they can take control of the culture and feel like they are shaping it in a way that's authentic to who they are and aligned with their value system. And then lastly, the design goals, as we were looking at the entire program, one was to make sure that we were targeting key influencers within that community first. So those of you who are involved in organizational change projects or have maybe done any kind of work in, for example, diffusion of innovations, know that when we're doing large scale organizational changes, it tends to be a race to 60% buy-in. That tends to be the inflection point in the S curve of adoption. So the faster we can get to 60% buy-in, the more likely we are to get the rest of the command to adopt those inclusive leadership principles that we're trying to instill. Well, we also know that the key to getting to 60% as quickly as possible is to identify the key influencers and opinion leaders and to get them bought in first, because they'll diffuse the message the fastest. And so this is kind of leading into how and why we're using organizational network analysis as we're bringing a program into the organization. That second bullet on the right, this was also a pretty significant departure from the way things are typically done in the military, but we were focused on this principle of adoption. How do we get NCOs to adopt these principles and then diffuse them, as opposed to top-down implementation? We're just doing it because big Air Force said we have to do it. It starts at the top and then it slowly makes its way down. By the time it gets to the people who it's designed for, it's so diluted and changed that the essence of the initiative has been completely lost. And it's also interesting, I'll just point out here, none of what I'm saying right now is particularly unique to the military. So this issue, for example, of top-down implementation or trying to get buy-in in the middle or identifying key influencers are the same principles that we're following when we're designing solutions for our corporate clients or our civilian clients. And then lastly, that final bullet there, really emphasizing, and the program spends a lot of time on introspection, really thinking about how you've become the leader you are today. Is that the leader you want to be going forward? And if not, what things do we need to do, or what adjustments do we need to make in order to get you on a path to more inclusively excellent leadership? So now I'm going to kind of transition into the use of Constellation and the ONA, but let me just pause there for a moment and ask or allow for any questions you might have about the program itself. All right, if there are none, then I'm going to move forward, assuming that you now have an excellent grounding in what NILE is. So I think most of you are familiar with organizational network analysis. I would assume that many of you are, but I'm not going to assume too much here. So let me give a little bit of kind of shape to what an organizational network analysis is, why we do it, and what it looks like. So As I mentioned, Polynode powers the actual engine on the ONA constellation, our platform, which is extracting that data and then moving it into organizational and individual reports. And really what we're interested in here is trying to identify how information's moving through these informal networks, who's connecting with who, what groups are connecting with what groups, who is bridging connections between disparate groups, and then how do we pinpoint influence and decision makers or knowledge brokers. And then also, kind of lastly, in that middle paragraph, how might we be able to identify potential isolates in a network who are maybe trying to plug in, but again, to that point of isolation, loneliness, and a lack of purpose, are there people who tend to be on the outside of the network? And if so, can we design a targeted intervention to try to pull them back into the network? As you know, if you've ever participated or seen it, the data collection process is very fast. It does help us accelerate insights that otherwise might take us months to glean through more traditional methods of focus groups or one-on-one meetings with leaders. We're very mindful of trying to keep our assessment to 15 minutes or less. We don't ask, while we may have 15 to 20 questions, you tend to be able to move through those questions pretty quickly. We have recently added the WHO 5 well-being index questions to our survey. So if you're familiar, these are 5 questions that are gauging an individual's level of well-being. And we've inserted those to try to demonstrate empiricism of the program itself. So can we show that those individuals who have participated in NILE are creating better conditions for well-being, connectedness within the command pre and post? So we'll come in and do a pre-assessment. We'll run NILE for about a year. We'll do a post-assessment, and then we're looking to see through that index that we've had the impact that we want to have. But then also visually, we want to see in the maps that we've created a greater level of network density, collaboration, shorter collaboration pathways, and that we're pulling people into the network in ways that we've designed through those interventions. So I've taken the command's name out, so we'll just go with Acme Explosives for this example, but this is the real map of one of the commands we work with. So the very first question, and this is not unique to us, this is most ONAs, start with this base collaboration question. Ours happens to be to identify up to 10 people in the command who you collaborate with to accomplish your work priorities. Again, just in the event that you're not familiar, this is, in our case, this works off a name generator. So they'll start to type a couple letters of a first name or last name, the name pops up and they select. This happens over and over and over and over and over again until we get this kind of picture of what collaboration looks like across the organization. Now, this particular map happens to be, again, from the unit we were working with out in Albuquerque. And the one thing I want to highlight here for those, again, who may not be aware is that the shape of the map has a very specific meaning. We didn't just create it that way because we think that looks cool, although we do think that's a pretty cool looking map. But the easiest way to explain this is to imagine we were all on a 10-person organization. We were part of a startup, let's say. And I'm in this company, you're in this company, there are 10 of us total. And if that question was asked, identify up to 10 people in the organization who you collaborate with to accomplish your work priorities. If we all chose each other as the answer to that question, that map would have what's called maximum reciprocity. And because it has maximum reciprocity, it would have maximum network density. So when I map it, we would basically be a giant blob of people all just right on top of each other. But now if you imagine that maybe it's like a month later and I ask that same question and then you all realize, like, we don't even know Brad. Brad doesn't even work at this company. I don't even know why I selected him as in that last question. So now you answer the question and the 9 of you all choose each other. And I choose all 9 of you because I want to be in this company, but none of you chose me. So what happens in that case is the 9 of you have maximum reciprocity, maximum density, but the map will now push me out. So it'll create a much longer collaboration pathway for me to get in. So this is running, in this particular case, this algorithm runs over and over and over and over again until it begins to give the map its shape, which is based on actual collaboration distance. Now, in this case, again, each of these nodes represents a person in the network. Each of the connections between them is a collaboration pathway, otherwise known as edges. And these are a combination of edges that could either be reciprocal, so going in both directions, or unidirectional, whether out or in this particular network. These nodes are sized by the total number of incoming nominations to that first question. So the more people who selected you as someone they collaborate with, the larger the node in the network. This happens to be everybody, whether an officer or whether a senior NCO or an NCO or an airman. So we have lots of different ways we can look at this map, right? This one strips everybody out except for the NCOs. So now I can see specifically how and who in the NCO network is communicating with one another. So we can begin to see where sources of connection, central connection, and collaboration might exist, and how NCOs might be moving information through each other in this particular network. A couple of things I want to highlight, and again, I'm not trying to talk down to anybody who's already uber familiar with this, but just a couple of things that are of importance to us in analyzing this map. The first one are looking for any bridges in the network. So where is information being moved between two disparate parts of the organization, and why might that bridge exist? Is that bridge existing because there's workflow inefficiency, or is that bridge existing for social reasons? Does that bridge exist because someone is trying to garner political and social capital in a network by keeping networks apart from each other? Why does this bridge exist, and how is this bridge being used in the network? So here you can see one highlighted that stands out. It's one of the coolest things on this map because it's the easiest example of a bridge in any network that I've seen probably in the last couple of years, because it's just so kind of in your face there on the bottom. But this map, just so you know what you're looking at, this population is their C-130 population. This population up in the upper right is their Osprey or the CV-22 population. So this is the helicopters that have the 360-degree rotating props. This is their central command and planning divisions. And then these are their back shops. So like electrical and plating and weapons and the various back shops that support both airframes. So in this particular case, this was a comms back shop. This was the C-130 back shop. And what was interesting about this, and this really didn't have anything to do with Nile, this was kind of an interesting aside that came out of the analysis, is that the C-130s had been grounded for much longer than were anticipated in normal maintenance cycles, and it was creating a major stress on that part of the command. And they had been working for a while to try to identify opportunities to shorten maintenance downtime and get these planes back up in the air. And what they discovered is that the longest lag time tended to be between the onboard communication systems that had to be replaced and then the actual crew itself that's responsible for that maintenance. And in this particular case, that bridge was existing to try to short circuit what was a very bureaucratic and long process of moving paperwork and getting the necessary parts in order to make something happen. So in this particular case, the bridge was trying to improve workflow efficiency, but doing so in such a way that maybe would raise some eyebrows amongst people in the central command. So what we were able to do is to look at the people, to go to this slide, who are central connectors in various parts of the network, and to bring the central connectors together directly. What was interesting was central connectors, for example, here, here, or here, in the actual comms division itself, had no direct way to connect with the central connectors on the actual air crew, uh, except through the central command or through the bridge. Right, so that was the only way they were. It was a really inefficient information flow system. So we were able to help them design an intervention for that that actually had nothing to do with the scope of work that we were doing for them, and we did it free of charge because that's how great we are. And then finally, you can see I talked about this earlier, this kind of group I've highlighted in the bottom, these isolates or periphery nodes. And again, using that example, the startup example, right? You all chose each other, nobody chose me, it pushes me out. So these are nodes that are existing on the exterior of the network, and you can see them kind of scattered all throughout. Isolates or periphery nodes aren't always a bad thing. Sometimes it's just relative to the newness of the individual within the organization. They just haven't had time to build their networks yet. So we have to juxtapose that information with a couple of other areas that we're interested in. For example, how might they report or self-report on the WHO 5 questionnaire? So are their well-being or potential isolation issues showing up in the way they're responding to those questions. How long have they been with the command? So if they've been with the command for 2 years and they're on a 10-person team, yet they show up as an isolate or a periphery node, that's problematic. We would expect them to be more connected into the network. And so we can use all of that information to help us determine who should be in some of these early Nile cohorts, right? So when we're bringing people in to participate in these workshops, where should we start? Who are the right participants? So rather than that historical top-down approach where we would just say, well, we have 100 NCOs and everybody needs to participate. So, just, everybody sign up for whatever, slot is appropriate for you. It might take us a year to get through 100 NCOs. But if we know we want to change the culture of the command, then we know it's a race to get to 60%. And we want the right first set of NCOs or second set of NCOs in these cohorts so that they can spread the messages much faster. Similarly, if we see NCOs where there tend to be a high degree of isolates and they're part of the network, we might want that NCO to be in one of the earlier cohorts, even though maybe that NCO is not particularly influential in the network. But we know that whatever conditions they're creating and they're part of the organization isn't conducive to that inclusive leadership excellence that I was talking about earlier. So that's telling you who's collaborating with who, but it's not necessarily telling you about the nature of that collaboration, how it's being experienced. It's really just looking at it sort of one-dimensionally. And so we add these dimensional questions around issues like trust or positive collaboration or competence to get a sense of how that collaboration is being experienced in the network. This is an example of that. So on a scale of 0 to 100, to what extent do each of the people you nominated in question 1 exhibit a positive approach when collaborating with others? So here we want to get a sense that, if I have to collaborate with Melissa, is that experience a good experience? Do I view that as a positive experience? And if not, then what we know is that people are more likely to want to work around that node in the network. If that experience is not a good experience, even though it might be more efficient for me to go directly to that node, I'm likely to try to bypass it or work around it. And now we have these inefficiencies or workarounds that are existing in the system, strictly because we maybe have a curmudgeonous node embedded somewhere in the middle of the organization. Just to show you a couple other examples. So these might be more traditional employee engagement survey type questions that you would see. I can clearly see my career path. I feel like I belong. These are questions that tend to come up in engagement related surveys. Obviously, the benefit of an ONA is I can work that data back into the map. So now I can see where particular parts of the organization are maybe not feeling as much like they belong or like they are connected to the mission and purpose. And again, that helps us design a targeted intervention by saying, okay, well, we can see there's clearly a belonging problem here. So what might we do? What kind of human-centered design intervention might we come up with that could help that group feel more connected to this particular organization? And then the last thing that I wanted to share was on the way we measure influence. So, influence is not strictly a measure of collaboration, who is collaborating with who. Although, the number of belly buttons that you're touching in a day does tell us how many, potential avenues you have to get a message out. But just because you have an opinion doesn't make you an opinion leader. And so we have to look at other factors that could be driving influence. So while collaboration is one, we also look at betweenness. So how many shortest paths connect through you in a particular network? For example, that node that I showed in one of the previous slides that was bridging the two networks would have a very low collaboration score, but a very high betweenness score because they're connecting those two parts of the network, shortest paths through that particular bridge. And then we ask a question in our engagement, or not engagement, in our ONA around tone. And that question is simply identify up to 5 people in this organization who you believe set the tone for how things really get done. And we ask that question, and then we create what's called a tone proportionality score. And here's why this matters, as opposed to just a raw score, how many people said you set the tone. If you imagine that you have a CEO in an organization, and let's say for question 1, identify up to 10 people who you collaborate with to accomplish your work priorities. Let's say 20 people chose the CEO as somebody they collaborate with to accomplish work priorities. But now let's say when I ask this next question, identify up to 5 people in the organization who set the tone for how things really get done. Let's say only 5 of the 20 people selected the CEO for that question as well. Well, now what we know is the CEO has a tone proportion of 29 or 25%, which is not at all what we would expect. We would expect that the 20 people reporting to the CEO, 17, 18 of them would probably also select that individual as someone who's setting the tone. So we look at tone proportion because we know in big organizations, especially like 1,000 people, if I'm answering that question, identify up to 5 people who set the tone for how things get done. If I'm a shop floor worker, the likelihood I selected the CEO is pretty high, because of course I would think the CEO is setting the tone. But if I'm not actually interacting with the CEO, I don't even know her name, she doesn't know my name, then I don't really have a way to gauge whether she's actually setting the tone for how things are getting done. So what we care about is how many people in that person's collaboration network also believe that individual is setting the tone. So we combine those factors and we come up with an influence score where the top level person in that network is 100, and then everything scales off of that. And that allows us to determine, going back to that NCO map that I shared with you, we can bring that coloring back into the map, or we can even size the nodes in that way to see which NCOs are wielding the most influence in that network. We would then juxtapose that information with the positive collaboration question to get a sense of whether that influence is being experienced in a positive or a negative way in the network, because not all influence is positive influence. And so again, if we're trying to get people to espouse the message and to get it out to the community, we want that to be coming from from individuals who we know have strong positive collaboration networks, in order to get others bought into what we're doing. So I'm going to stop there, because that's the end. That's why I'm going to stop there. But hopefully that gives you a good sense of NILE, how we're using NILE to try to address these various issues and get the program diffused. And I know there are 14 questions in the chat, Melissa, but I haven't had an opportunity to look at them. So I'm happy to take any questions or whatever would be appropriate next.
Anyone want to ask Brad a question? All right, well, we got one we can get started with. So it was back a few slides, or just maybe if you wanted to pull up any one of those ONA maps, but you did a really nice job of explaining how to read them and start to like assess. But maybe can you talk a little bit more about the critical thinking and the diagnosing, and do you start to quickly categorize things as maybe good or bad, or need to investigate more, or hey, that's a positive thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. You'll look at a map like this. Actually, let's get out. This one's kind of negative. Let's move to a different. Let me go back. Let's go to the big one. All right, let's go here. So, as an analyst, when I first start to perform the analysis, I'm not really looking at anything as good or bad. My first job is to just make observations, period. So I'm not trying to understand why something might be happening in a network at this stage. I'm just trying to understand what is happening. And so, for example, we know, again, picking on this person again, we know that this person is a bridge in the network. Whether that bridge is a good bridge, a bad bridge, whether it's keeping information away from those two parts of the organization or trying to pass information, I don't know the answer to that yet. But I would document that in the beginning as an early observation. I would go through and try to identify all the people with high bridging scores in the network, determine where they are, what groups are they bridging. And so you're just kind of going through this observational process at that point. I'll try to layer in other information. So then I may, for example, on the bridging, then I want to go look at how the network is seeing that bridge. So in other words, questions around positive collaboration. We have other questions around trust. So trust dimensional scores, questions around competence. Is that particular individual viewed as competent in their role? And so I'm taking that information and now I'm trying to put some color to that observation a little bit. So, okay, can I get a sense of how people are experiencing that bridge? And then also, how is the bridge experiencing the network? Right. So there are individual experience questions, which you saw some, I feel like I belong. I feel connected to the mission and purpose. I have everything I need to do my best possible work. There are a series of 7 individual experience questions. So now I'm taking that information. So now I can see what the bridge is doing. I can see how the networks are experiencing the bridge, and I can see how the bridge is experiencing the networks. And now I can start to move into this next phase of the analysis, which we would refer to as the insight phase. So phase 1 is observational. Phase 2 is insight. So in insight, now I'm trying to answer the question, why is this happening? So in the first stage, just what is happening. In the second stage, why. So here I'm storytelling a bit because you have to. So you are guessing to some extent, although it should at this point be an educated guess. Um, if we get into the insight stage and the story doesn't add up for me, the hypothesis doesn't add up for me, then we might design a focus group of some sort. So we would have to carefully kind of curate that so it's not obvious why we're bringing different people together. But I might go back to the command and say, hey, I'd love to run a focus group with these 6 people, 45 minutes. Here are the questions I want to ask. Can we make this happen? I know going into the Q&A session what information I'm looking for. The group doesn't necessarily know what I'm looking for, but I'm trying to get a deeper understanding as to how or why something might be happening that as an analyst, I don't have a ready explanation for. So I just use the bridge as the example, but that would happen anywhere in the network. So if I see a high degree of isolates, like this is pretty high. These were more isolates than I would expect to see in a network. When we actually went in and analyzed it, that's the training and onboarding group for the C-130 community. So all of those people you see in that part of the community largely connected to these 2 nodes, which are basically responsible for bringing people, brand new people into the command. So it actually was not as unusual as it looked, or as potentially dangerous as it looked. It's really just a matter of that's the part of the network where people are coming into the network. So it would make sense that they're not as plugged in just yet. Yeah, I
Awesome.
see a hand, Mandy.
Yeah, I was curious how you handle just questions of confidentiality. I know a lot of this data is anonymized, but I'm sure that there are concerns, from the participants and, on. So would be very curious what your perspective is and just how you handle it.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So a couple of things I would say about it. One is the importance of confidentiality and protecting an individual's response to any one question is all over the assessment. So that data, that language is all over. Um, we also, just as an organization, we will not conduct passive network analysis. So what you're seeing right now is an active analysis, meaning it's questionnaire based, right? So individuals are responding to questions. We tell them why they're taking the survey. They know they're taking the survey, and they know that we're using that information to attempt to improve collaboration and communication across the network. So we won't do, for example, on a passive ONA, you might do an email meta dump where you're just taking all the email data and you're mapping the networks, or like any social media platform, Instagram, whatever, like they're constantly mapping to determine where and who the influencers are. So just as a philosophy, as an organizational philosophy, we don't do that. We don't conduct passive analysis. We've even been asked to participate in projects where we would combine our active data with passive data, and we've chosen not to participate in that. What we will share with the leadership and with the organization is not how any individual responded to a question, but we may share, for example, how the network is seeing an individual. So if 20 people selected me as their answer to question 1, and my positive collaboration score was an 82, and the peer average or the mean of my peers was an 86, I would come back, we would come back and say, here's a list of individuals who by the network rating, and we're referring to the network as a person, right? By the network rating, were at least 1 standard deviation below the mean of their peer group, or were at least 1 standard deviation above the mean in their peer group. So we're beginning to show in a kind of bell curve way, assuming that the data comes back as a bell curve, which it almost always does, how people are seeing other individuals within the network. But that map, to go to this one. So this map was based off of an individual response question. And that individual question was, I feel like I belong at this organization. We would never share this map with leadership, because if leadership was able to deduce through other maps and other questions like who this node is specifically, then they would now know how that node responded to the question, I feel like I belong at this command. So that would be an example of a question that would be off limits in terms of our sharing it back with the command. However, as an analyst, I would look at this and I might come back to the command and say, we're clearly seeing challenges in this part of the organization. Here's what we might recommend in terms of an appropriate intervention for that part of the organization.
Right. So just as a little bit of a follow up, if you identify isolates, for instance, like you were talking about, um, you do a bit more digging. And what if you find out that no, it's not about the new hire training? It's actually there's legitimate, real concerns around that particular isolate's wellness, right? Because the point of this is suicidal, preventing or diminishing or
Mm-hmm.
reducing suicidal ideation. What then do you do for those like cases where there are real bells going off
Yep.
and concerns?
No, yep. Also a great question. So in that particular case, we would really zero in on the NCO who's responsible for creating that the culture in that part of the organization. So we would begin to dig into that and try to get a deeper understanding of what might be happening from a leadership responsibility part of that map. And a couple things can happen in that instance. One might be that we discover, and this happens pretty often, that the NCO core in any branch of the military tends to be very overtaxed in terms of time and resources. And so we may find that it's really an accessibility problem. Like these isolated nodes just simply can't get access to the person who's supposed to be responsible for their overall well-being and ability to do their jobs effectively. So we'll look at all of that, and then we'll come back to a command with leadership development recommendations for different individuals in a network. Or we may say, it doesn't look like it's an access problem. It doesn't look like it's an unconscious bias problem, which is another issue that we'll look at. Is that isolation happening because there may be unconscious bias happening there? Or at least we start with the assumption that if there is bias, it's unconscious. We then have to later determine whether that is the case or is not the case. But we may, let's say that as I was starting to look at this, and this is actually what I did in this map, you're looking at it here colored by responses to belonging, but I can very easily toggle that to look at the map along gender lines. So I can toggle that map, and then I can begin to see, like, if there's a lot of isolation happening, and let's just say hypothetically it was here, and the NCOs responsible here were men or males who were communicating with each other, but didn't seem to be communicating with a female demographic that was isolated. We can then begin to think about what a more appropriate intervention might look like in that part of the organization. And we may suggest to the command that these 3 NCOs should be involved in the first cohort. And I know, as the person facilitating that cohort, why different people were selected to be there. And so as I'm facilitating, I'm really hitting on very key points and trying to then at that point determine whether or not, yes, we've now given this person the information they need to go back and try to do better. Or it seems to me, because it's a 3-day program, it seems to me that by the end of the 3rd day, the command probably needs to consider making a change in this part of the organization. So we will debrief command leadership at the end of every workshop to tell them how we think it went and what changes they might want to consider based on how those workshops went.
Amazing work. Thanks.
But yes, you're very welcome. But to the privacy question, and this comes up all the time, and it's a tough one for us. People will say, well, if you know someone's isolated and you know that isolation is for reasons that need to be addressed, why can't you just give us the list so we can go fix it? And that's the challenge, right? I mean, the way we come back to that always is that would violate the confidentiality of the participants. And typically, if a node is isolated, it has a small collaboration, but by its very nature, by the way we're defining isolation, it has a small collaboration network. So we would know if anyone chose that node. I mean, you would be able to know right away who it was and why. So now you're putting specific names to. But yeah, I can probably once a month I'm probably having that argument with senior leadership.
Right. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
hey, Brad. So wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
This Nat. And I was interested, you touched on some of this in responding to Mandy's question, but so if I think of it sort of like a diagnosis, treatment, and reinforcement, and you're definitely this is important for selecting the cohorts. It's interesting too that you were doing the debrief sessions with when they were doing the training. And so I was interested if you uh, could just share a little bit more about how they, other ways they used this that shaped the training itself. And then if you had had any opportunity to do like a post analysis or those types of things.
Yeah, great question. So about 80% of Nile is what we would consider to be base or foundational. So at this point, as we sit here today, Nile is now in 8 different command structures across the Air Force. So it started in Albuquerque. It's now spread to other elements of the Air Force. And when we go into any new command, about 80% of that material is going to be common material, kind of common core material across all the various commands. We'll then use the analysis to really shape that other 20%. And we know that, it's Pareto, right? So we know that like that 20% is probably critical to the 80% of behavioral change that we need to see in that network. So we might come in and identify, for example, that in this particular command, just using this as the example, these silos are undesirable. So, or without explanation, without clear explanation. If that happens, then we may think about how do we work some pieces into the program that are really focused on cross-functional collaboration and and then when we design, to go even further with that, when we design participation in the workshops, we would specifically choose central connectors from each of the locations to give them an opportunity to spend 3 days with each other. And we might have a module that's specifically focused on how might we improve the ways in which we collaborate with each other in this effort to build a more inclusively excellent organization. So what are the ways in which we could do that? So in those instances, and we have elements of the 3 days where we use design thinking methodology, and we'll use that approach to help them kind of co-create the solutions. And going back to the comment that I made earlier about adoption versus implementation, we're very much focused on getting them to adopt the principles as opposed to telling them to adopt the principles. And so anything we can do to allow them to co-create the answer tends to work much better. And so that's how we would use that to kind of tailor something that we might be seeing that is unique to a particular population. I will say though, I mean, now that we're in the 8th different command structure, I don't want to say we've seen it all, but we've seen a lot. I mean, we've had more than 10,000 Nile participants over the last 3 years. And there's not much at this point as an analyst that has surprised me anymore. There was some stuff in the beginning, and some of that was just my own learning curve. My background being in the Navy, the Air Force is a little different. So some of that was just getting over my own learning curve there and kind of figuring out how they collaborate. But it's been a while since I've had a map that shocked me, where I saw something and didn't have a good answer for it. But that's always fun. My very favorite thing is to clean up the data first and then look at that first collaboration map. And it's like Christmas. It's like unwrapping a present. So, but yeah, I mean, this is pretty consistent. This map you're seeing here is pretty consistent with what you see across these various levels, where you have airframes that are pretty tightly connected. There's a central command, and then there's kind of supporting back shops. This is pretty standard, actually. And I think there were 2 parts of that question. Did I get them both, or did I only get one?
Yeah, no, I think that was really that's wonderful that you were able to have that. And so so the only other was, have you had an opportunity to do like post evaluation on these?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. And so we have, in 3 different commands, they're on their 3rd year. And so we've done Constellation. We recommend that it be done 9 to 18 months apart. So if you go less than 9, there's not really enough time for me to say that the shifting of the map had anything to do with what we did. And if you go longer than 18 months, there could be other factors that are impacting what's happening. So we try to hit 12 months, 1 year if we can, 9 to 18. We have 2 commands that have done 3 different assessments. And so what we really have been looking at in terms of just the empiricism is looking at, first of all, the self-reporting of the junior airmen who are reporting to NCOs who have been through the program. So, they have that self-reporting, or like, as I said, we use the WHO5 wellness index. Like they've reported, we have those numbers. Are the junior airmen who are reporting to NCOs who have participated in NILE having a better experiences than those who maybe have not? Or if we see scores in one area and then the NCO participated, did we see a shift later? And then the other thing that we're looking at is network density in those areas where NCOs have participated. So have they tightened up their networks for the people who are reporting to them, again, in the spirit of creating that more inclusively excellent and connected culture? Or have those networks spread? And if they spread, why did they spread? So have collaboration holes been created where maybe they weren't intended in the network? So yeah, we're seeing some interesting things for sure. But yeah, still really in the data collection stage. We're working with a company, or not a company, a part of the Air Force called A1Z, which is out of the Pentagon. They're responsible for resiliency across the Air Force, and they're really keen to measure, to prove empirically that the program does what it says it's going to do. And our pushback on that has been, to date, we just don't have enough of that data yet. Like we need to keep collecting the data until I can say with some degree of confidence. But we're getting there. I mean, 10,000 participants at this point. But the problem, as you rightly pointed out, Nat, is the whole, like, you need a pre and a post, and not everyone who has participated in NILE has done a post. So they all do a pre, and then some of them, depending on budgeting concerns or constraints, have maybe not been able to do that post at the end.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I mean, those all make sense in terms of checking with all the objectives. And then I think it seems like it'd also be interesting as it develops in terms of the NCO's development, because
Yes.
as I hear you, you're really addressing an aspect that's very important, but hasn't been part of their training. I mean, the base scores, it's sort of like learned helplessness on affecting the culture. And so
Yeah.
anything you can do is positive. So I think that'll be fascinating to see if going through this experience has an influence on that.
Yeah, and I would say, so I just dropped in the chat a link to it's our website, but there's a page dedicated to NILE, and if you scroll through there, you can read some of the participant feedback, which has been extra. So we do qualitatively ask them. So they rate the program on a 5.0 scale. Close to 10,000 participants, and the program's rated 4.9 out of 5 on overall satisfaction and value. But then there's a follow-up question to that, which is, what would you tell your fellow NCOs about NILE? And that qualitative feedback has been extraordinary. I mean, well beyond anything we could have imagined. And I think you're right. It's because you're tapping into something that they've just not had the opportunity to participate in. Yeah, it's been really great. It's my favorite project by far of all the things we're doing. Way better than the NCAA, in case you're wondering.
I know we're a little bit over time. Want to be conscientious of that. Does anyone else have anything for Brad? Got a ton of compliments in the chat if you haven't seen them. I know when you first shared this with the NYU community, I deeply admired how you were using this kind of technology to like marry that up with like really humane principles and how to go about this kind of work, and just extend so much gratitude for the fact that you're doing this and you're gracious with your time and willing to share.
My pleasure. Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me in. I love talking about it. Like I said, it's my favorite work to do.
Awesome. Well, you guys can find Brad on LinkedIn. And again, thank you guys so much for being here today, and thanks for your time.
Yep. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great weekend.